So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so delighted that you were able to come to this talk by my young colleague, R. Khari Brown. Um, he is an associate professor of sociology in the sociology department here at Wayne. He teaches and researches on the sociology of religion. His research explores how race impacts the relationship between religion and social political behavior and attitudes. He is very well known in the world beyond Wayne State University. He is a co-investigator of national politics study, a project funded by the Louisville Institute, the Ishikar Fund, and the University of Michigan. The National Politics Study is a biannual study that assesses American political attitudes and behaviors and religious life. He's also a consultant for the Pew Research Center for this year, 2020-21. It has a survey on African American religion. I mean, there's a lot more you can say about this young man who joined us a few years ago as an assistant professor. But one of the most endearing thing is to me is he is part of a dynamic duo of he and his father. His father, Ronald Brown, is an associate professor in the political science department, and the two of them have published together and so on. And so as a father of sons, I feel so delighted for Ronald. And every time I run into to run in the corridor, I take a breath and I say, "How is Khari?"
Mm.
And he pauses and then bursts out in a beaming smile and says, "Khari is okay." And then, of course, he makes sure he mentions his other sons as well, but Khari. But when I run into Khari on the corridor, I say, "How's that?" He said, "Oh, okay." Very quickly. He doesn't kind of tarry on that. And so, but Khari has been a great, great friend of the Humanities Center. He has been giving Brumback talks since 2006 as an assistant professor. And then he continued in 2016 when he became an associate professor. His first Brumback talk was entitled Racial Differences in the Social Service Provision of Black and White Religious Congregations. And he did that in 2006, 2010. He gave one entitled The Impact of Religion on African American Immigration Attitudes. And in 2011, still as an assistant professor, he gave a talk on religion and racial segregation attitudes. And then in 2015, as an associate professor, he gave a talk on racial identity politics, survey research, and the program of research on Black Americans, 1958 through 2015, and so on. And in 2016, he gave one on race, religion, and politics. In 2017, he gave one on racial profiling. 2018 on political science, race, religion, and politics of America. And today he's giving a talk on race, religion, and environmental activism. I also want to mention that he is currently a member of the Center's advisory board and has made contributions already, including giving us ideas about what could be our next theme and so on. And so I'm delighted to welcome to the podium virtually my young friend and colleague, Professor R. Khari Brown. His talk, as I said before, is going to be on race, religion, and environmental activism.
Thanks, Walter. Thank you for the introduction. That was a great introduction. And I'd like to say as well that these talks, the opportunity to present my work has been at the center has been extremely helpful. All of the talks that I've given, I and or my colleagues, we ended up publishing them in peer-reviewed journals. The talk that I'm giving today is, oh, shucks. Oh, now to stop this up. The talk I'm giving today, I changed, it's slightly different when I do, but it's on race, religious tradition, and environmental conservation. We just published this within the sociology of religion. And Dad and I and another colleague, we have a book coming out on race, religion, and politics, where we look at 60 years of survey research. It should come out in March. We're hoping it should come out in March. But what we talk about in the book, you guys already know because we presented it here at the Humanities Center. So again, thank you for the opportunity again to present my work. So as Walter stated, I do work on race, religion, and politics, and particularly social justice. But before I begin my presentation, I do want to talk a bit about how my identity and values impact the questions that I ask, how I understand my research findings, and why I believe my work is important. And I thought about doing this because last week I talked to my capstone class about Howard Zinn's work on values in social science. And he made the case that social science, as hard as we try, we can't be purely objective because we're human. I mean, our experiences and our identity shape how we see the world and how we think about research questions. And the idea is not that our experiences will bias how we interpret our findings or that we would misrepresent our findings, but it does color what we pay attention to and how we see the world and why our research findings are meaningful to us. So I make that point just so that you have an understanding of where I'm coming from. So my Blackness and my upbringing in a fairly political Black church and my attending an interracial social justice oriented church as a junior faculty member greatly impacts my research outlook. I grew up in Bethel AME Church, Ann Arbor. Bethel is a Black church located on the north end of the University of Michigan's campus in Ann Arbor. And growing up there, I attended a number of worship services and special programs and discussion groups where we were regularly reminded of our group's legacy in making this country's rhetorical commitment to freedom and democracy real. As you can see, Bethel was the church on the left side, right here. That's the north picture. But because I attended Bethel in these meetings and these services and had these discussions, it always made perfect sense to me that religion would be concerned with temporal matters. I mean, that to me was obvious, even before I really started thinking about a research plan. That's the way I thought. And it also made sense that religious persons would side with marginalized groups as God did African Americans throughout US history. So for example, let me give an example of what I'm talking about here. Growing up in Bethel AME Church, every Black History Month in February, we had church programs that highlighted African American contributions to law, medicine, business, sports, and politics in the USA and around the world. We had annual Martin Luther King Day celebrations, where we all learned about the Black church's role in the civil rights movement, including the role that some of our members played. Every election cycle, if it was a local election or statewide election or a national election, candidates made appearances where they encouraged us to vote, and some of these candidates were church members. As a 17-year-old in 1993, I remember having discussions with other teens and adults at the church about the police beating up Martin King in Los Angeles and the protests and civil unrest that followed. Now, I would say that attending Central United Methodist Church as a junior professor here at Wayne between 2005 and 2010 has had an equal impact on my views of the religion's role in the world. Central is the church to the right. Central is an interracial church located not too far from Wayne's campus. It's located in downtown Detroit, very close to Tiger Stadium and Ford Field. And it has a long history of social justice. They were involved in the civil rights movement of the 1950s through 60s and 70s. They were involved in the refugee movement of the 1980s and are involved in the immigrant rights movement today. In this picture, actually, you see here, the pastor Jill Zindel is to my left of the podium, and they're having a press conference. This was in August 2018, in which she announced their church's commitment to allowing these Albanian asylum seekers to seek refuge in the church as they file their asylum claims and to avoid ICE. They've been involved in anti-poverty campaigns, all the anti-war movements, you name it, they were involved. And the pastor and the members at this church seamlessly tie their faith beliefs to the political behavior and rhetoric. I'm saying all this to say that my group identity as an African-American, along with my formative and adult experiences in politically and theologically progressive religious spaces, strongly shape my research interest and outlook. And it shapes the approach that I'm taking this afternoon with my presentation today. So, religious groups play a strong role in encouraging Americans to think about their role in maintaining the environment in the local communities and around the world. And so in this table right here, we have public opinion polls from 2000 to 2020. And basically what these national polls are showing is that on any given worship service, roughly half of American worship goers may hear a sermon or a speech or an announcement about an environmental issue. And also what you see, I don't present it here, but among those that do, it's very likely the case that when they do hear messages about environmental issues, it tends to be a message that encourages individuals to conserve the environment, to take efforts to sustain the environment, including supporting policies that conserve and sustain the environment. Central United Methodist Church, which I talked about just a moment ago, illustrate this point very well. Central's worship service on October 13, 2019 was Environmental Justice Sunday. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, a Wayne State grad, by the way, was the guest speaker. And she was an ideal candidate to speak that Sunday, because she co-sponsored the Green Deal legislation. That's the legislation that aims to create more opportunities for clean energy jobs, so to reverse the effects of climate change and pollution, and to reduce economic inequality in the process. The worship announcements, songs, and Tlaib's speech itself emphasize the obligation of Central members to work at making sure that all God's children have a safe and healthy place to work, play, and if they choose, worship. As the bulletin indicates, after church service, churchgoers were invited to attend a meeting by Detroit Sunrise, a local environmental group where members could discuss ways to keep the neighborhoods clean and healthy. They were also able to discuss strategies to push elected officials to do all in their power to improve and protect the environmental health of the communities. Now, many, if not most, of Central's members probably agree with their pastor, Jill Zendel, and the guest speaker, Rashida Tlaib, that they have a faith obligation to support governmental policies that preserve the environment. However, it's very possible, it's quite possible, actually, that Central members, they may be anomalous. I mean, it wouldn't be too unreasonable to believe that many Americans separate their religious from their social political beliefs, including their views on environmental issues. It's also not too hard to imagine that religious beliefs may help frame politically conservative positions on environmental and other issues. Lynn White made this very case in his very popular 1967 article in the journal Science. In it, he argued that Americans' acceptance of environmental pollution is rooted in a Judeo-Christian ethic that God gives humans all of creation to dominate and to exploit as they see fit. There's also quite a bit of research that shows that religious affiliation associates with environmental attitudes. So individuals that are connected to different religions may adopt different views on the appropriate roles of government in conserving the environment. So in a nutshell, there's good reason to believe that not all religious persons take the same position on the appropriate role of the government in conserving the environment. In this study, I test this assumption by examining the association between religious-based environmental beliefs and environmental policy attitudes. Now, I do so by looking at how race may impact or moderate this relationship. As the first study of its kind, I hope that these findings provide insight into how racial experiences impact the meaningfulness of faith beliefs to environmental policy attitudes. So what the literature shows is that American worship goers that connect their faith beliefs to their obligation to preserve the environment tend to embrace an environmental stewardship theology. This theology argues that God entrusts humans to care for the earth by ensuring that it continues to sustain and enhance life. Environmental stewards largely question our economy's reliance upon fossil fuels, which lead to elevated carbon emissions that they believe warm the planet and contributes to natural disasters. These persons also view the waste, a byproduct of overproduction, and the subsequent environmental challenges of landfills, incinerators, and toxic waste dumps, along with the associated health risks, as sinful. Now, many adherents to this perspective identify as religious liberals, and they tend to embrace aspects of liberation theology that emphasize God's call to stand in solidarity with the poor and powerless. And so it follows that many environmental stewards believe that the fact that the poor and powerless suffer the most from environmental disasters and are much more likely to live in areas with polluted air, water, and soil as a further affront to God. Let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about. I think that the call and response section of the worship service that Environmental Sunday really exemplifies what I'm talking about. If you focus on the highlighted area, it states, help us to listen and heed the warnings of climate scientists, who are modern prophets calling us to wake up and take bold actions necessary to care for our planet home and the future generation of all species. Forgive us of our failure to see what is before our eyes and our arrogance for thinking we know better than you. Now, on the opposite side of the religious environmental continuum is the environmental dominion belief. Now, like environmental stewards, dominion believers believe that God created the earth. They part ways, however, in their belief to whom the earth belongs. So while environmental stewards tend to believe that God owns the earth and humans, we are its trustee, dominion-oriented religious persons tend to believe that God gave humans the earth to exploit for their well-being. And going a step further, dominion believers tend to believe that our nation's economic and military dominance are evidence of providence. They're evidence of God's doing. So as a result, they tend to view limits on this nation's economic and military power through excessive regulations, even if meant to maintain the environment, as anti-Christian and anti-American. Now let's take a look at this quote to the right by James Wanless. He's a senior fellow at the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. He states that the Cornwall Alliance declares climate concern anti-Christian, claiming that such environmentalism constitutes a rival globalist religion that demeans God's sustaining providence, debases humanity's God-given dominion over earth, threatens the sanctity of life, and harms the poor by diminishing prospects for fossil fuel development. So it's reasonable to expect that environmental stewards are more likely than others, and particularly dominion-oriented believers, to support policies aimed at conserving the environment. It's much less clear, however, at least to me, if these beliefs are equally meaningful to the environmental conservation attitudes of different racial groups. Blacks and Hispanics, but particularly Blacks, are more likely than whites to live near toxic waste dumps, landfills, and incinerators. And because they're more limited income and wealth, Blacks and Hispanics are also less capable of moving away from environmentally polluting industries that contribute to climate change, like the Marathon Oil Refinery in Southwest Detroit. The 48217 zip code where the refinery is located is disproportionately Black and Hispanic, and it's the most heavily polluted zip code in the state. Blacks and Hispanics are also less capable than our whites of fleeing natural disasters that scientists argue are caused by global warming. In this sense, for Black and Hispanics, environmental concerns are much more of a practical question of what needs to be done to survive right now. Then it may be a theological or philosophical question about how one should act ethically, regardless of one's safety, comfort, and exposure to environmental pollutants. Now, on the other hand, for whites, given that they are less likely than African Americans and Hispanics to be exposed to harmful pollutants right now, environmental questions are arguably, for them, more theological than practical. We'll get into this. But these disparate lived experiences may contribute to religious beliefs maintaining a weaker and or more inconsistent relationship with Black and Hispanic environmental attitudes than it does for whites. All right, so these are my, two hypotheses. So one, among whites, environmental stewards are more likely than those that reject this premise to support environmental conservation policies. And two, among Blacks and Hispanics, environmental stewardship is unrelated to environmental policy attitudes. Let me make sure I'm on the right. Okay, yeah, I'm make sure I'm on the right. Okay, all right. So in testing these hypotheses, I am relying upon the 2004 Public Religion Research Institute data. And well, I'm relying upon the Public Religion Research Institute data. For the analysis that I'm presenting right now, I'm going to rely upon the 2014 Public Religion Research Institute data. But I'll also talk about data that we analyzed from 2010, 12, and 15. But the Public Religion Research Institute data is a national survey. It's like a poll. So they collected a random sample of individuals to ask a number of questions about their views on religion, the environment, and a host of other issues. And to do this, they randomly they collected people's cell phone and telephone numbers, and they randomly called the numbers and asked for individuals to participate in the survey. And they called and interviewed people between September and October of 2014. And they interviewed adults age 18 and up. And they roughly interviewed about 3,000 people. And again, just to be clear, I'll make this point a little bit later. This is a sample, and this is for the students that are listening. This is a random sample, so they did not interview every single person in the country. They did not interview every single adult in the country. They interviewed a random sample of adults in the country. And because the sample is random, the researchers argue that the responses of the individuals in this survey are representative of the population at large. I'll talk a bit about this in a couple slides. All right, so table one, we're looking at the relationship between race and policy attitudes. So what we see here is that African Americans and Hispanics were more likely than whites to say, when they were asked a question about whether or not they believe the government needs to do more to address the issue of climate change, African American and Hispanics, top row right here, were more likely than whites to say that they believe the government needs to do more to address the issue of climate change. African Americans and whites, African American and Hispanics were also more likely than whites to say that they did not favor the building of the Keystone Pipeline. And just as a refresher, this survey was done in 2014, and this issue received media attention in that year. The Keystone Pipeline was a construction project that ran an oil pipeline from Canada to Texas. Environmental activists were concerned that it was a risky project because if the pipe burst, as these projects have done in the past, the pipes have done in the past, it would contaminate the groundwater. So that was the environmental concern. And to that question, African Americans and Hispanics were more likely than whites to say that they did not favor the building of the Keystone Pipeline. However, whites were more likely than African Americans and Hispanics to say that they supported renewable energy research and the limiting of power plant emissions. Individuals, as I stated, were also asked their opinion of the degree to which they believe that humans are God's stewards and that God tasked humans with taking care of the earth. Now, to this question, we don't really see racial differences in how individuals respond to this question. Whites, Blacks, and Hispanics are all relatively equally likely, statistically speaking, to say that they believe that humans are God's stewards and that humans are tasked with taking care of the earth. Okay, now we're on to table 3, and this is a slide where I am testing my hypotheses. So in table 3, we're looking at the probability estimates by environmental stewardship and race while controlling for social demographics, religious affiliation, and political partisanship. To put this a little bit more plainly, we are looking at the relationship between how individuals answer the stewardship question and how they answer questions about whether or not they think the government needs to do something about climate change, whether or not they don't favor the Keystone Pipeline, and whether or not they support renewable energy research and limiting power plant emissions. So we're looking at the relationship between how they answer the environmental stewardship question and how they answer the environmental policy question, while taking into account demographics, religious affiliation, and political partisanship. So assuming that everyone in the sample has the same demographics, age, gender, education, income, region, and they are of the same religious affiliation, the same political party, assuming that is the case, what's the connection between how people answer the environmental, the environmental stewardship question and the environmental policy question? And we're looking at this relationship among each race separately. One more thing to mention so that this makes sense to people, particularly the undergrads. Pay attention to this top number right here. This is the probability estimate that environmental stewards and those that reject environmental stewards would support the idea that the government needs to do something about climate change. All right. So this is a probability that stewards say the government needs to do something about climate change. This is the probability that individuals that reject stewardship believe the government needs to do something about climate change. The confidence interval are the numbers in the brackets. So this tells us that there's a 95% probability that this estimate right here lies within this range of values. So remember, we're using a sample, we're not using the population. So the sample, researchers that collect these samples assume that how individuals answer these questions reflect how the population would answer these questions. But we don't have the population. We have a sample of the population. So we're making statistical estimates. Each sample responses to these questions reflect the actual population. So the asterisks right here, asterisk here, here, and here, this tells us the degree to which we can trust the accuracy of the relationship or the size of the difference between how stewards and non-stewards answer this question. All right. So if we have two asterisks, which we have here, here, and here, this tells us that statistically speaking, there's less than a 1% probability that the relationship or the size of the difference in the attitudes between environmental stewards and non-stewards are due to chance and luck, which means there's a 1% probability that these differences are not due to chance and luck. So what we're saying here basically is that if you see an asterisk, there's a good enough chance that we can believe that there's a relationship. There's a good enough chance that there are differences in how stewards and non-stewards view environmental conservation policies. If you don't see an asterisk next to a racial group, it means we don't have enough confidence to say that how people answer the questions in the survey are actually different from one another. All right, we'll talk about this a bit later. All right, so if we look at the white population right here, what we find is that whites that say that humans are God's stewards, they are more likely than whites that don't believe this to say the government needs to do something about climate change. And we see the same relationship among Hispanic Americans. We don't have statistical evidence that environmental stewards and non-environmental stewards answer this question differently among African Americans. I mean, there seems to be a fairly sizable gap. We don't have enough confidence that it's a meaningful gap here. When we look at this question of not favoring the Keystone Pipeline, what we find here is a very similar pattern of relationships. Whites that say that humans are God's stewards and are the caretakers of the earth, they are more likely than whites that reject this idea to not favor the Keystone Pipeline. among African Americans and Hispanics, we don't have evidence that this is a relationship that we can trust. And going a step further, the highlighted area indicates that race is statistically moderating this relationship. And by that I mean that the white relationship between environmental stewardship and not favoring the Keystone Pipeline is stronger, statistically stronger than is the Black relationship. And finally, when we're looking at support for renewable energy research and limiting power plant emissions, it's the same pattern. Among whites, those individuals that say that humans are God's stewards are more likely than individuals that don't believe this to support renewable energy research and placing limitations on power plant emissions. Again, we do not have statistical evidence that this relationship persists among African Americans and Hispanics. And in fact, this relationship is statistically stronger among whites than it is among African Americans. Now, I'm not, because of time and this, I don't want to present too many tables. I didn't present this other data, but we ran the same analysis on the 2010, 12, and 2015 Public Religion Research Institute data. And we found a very similar pattern of findings. So among whites, these studies indicate that environmental stewards and religious liberals are consistently more supportive of governmental regulations to protect the environment, to reduce carbon emissions in vehicles, and to oppose fracking. We heard a lot about fracking during the debates. But just in case some of you don't know what fracking is a drilling technique that companies employ to fracture bedrocks by shooting highly pressurized chemicals and other liquids into the rocks so to release natural gas and oil. Environmental activists fear that some of the chemicals companies use to break up the rocks may seep into the contaminant, seep into and contaminate the groundwater. So again, white environmental stewards and religious liberals are more likely to oppose fracking than are whites that reject environmental stewardship and are more religiously conservative. Among African Americans and Hispanics, we find little evidence that there is a connection between environmental stewardship and religious liberal beliefs with their environmental policy and attitudes. So, in sum, three main findings are the following. One, white environmental stewards and religious liberals are consistently more likely than other whites to support governmental sponsored environmental conservation efforts. Two, I have some evidence for this relationship among Hispanics. And three, I have very little, if any, evidence for this relationship among Blacks. At the beginning of my talk, I presented Central as a case study in environmental stewardship. This study suggests that whites with religious beliefs similar to those espoused in the call and response prayer at Central tend to support environmental conservation policies. We find much less support for this relationship among Hispanics and Blacks, however. Now, this doesn't mean that Black and Hispanics are less concerned about environmental issues or that they oppose religion taking stands on environmental issues. Our own study shows that Hispanics are as, if not more supportive of environmental conservation policies than are whites. Black and Hispanics are also equally likely to believe in the concept of environmental stewardship. Another study showed that Black and Hispanics are more likely to support their clergy and religious leaders speaking out about environmental issues and taking stands on this issue. Nonetheless, we still find that religious beliefs associate with environmental policy attitudes less consistently among Blacks and Hispanics than is the case for whites. Now, these differences may reflect differences in racial group positions. This is what we're speculating. And as I said earlier, are at greater risk of living near environmental hazards like fossil fuel producing oil refineries, incinerators, waste dumps, etc. It means that fixing this problem is a practical question for right now, not a theological or philosophical one. But for whites, the fact that they are largely protected, compared to African Americans and Hispanics, from environmental risk right now, it allows them greater ease to put aside these practical questions and think about these issues as a question of theology or philosophy. That is, how should one act? How should one act ethically if they're not currently in harm's way, and if they're currently profiting or benefiting in some way from a fossil fuel-based economy? At this point, we can only speculate if, these theological or practical questions contribute to the differences that we observe. To better understand these differences, we'll need survey questions that probe at racial group positioning and experiences, religious-based environmentalism, and a broader array of environmental policy questions. We'll also take qualitative approaches where researchers ask individuals to explain how their religious beliefs shape their environmental policy attitudes. These limitations notwithstanding, this is one of the few, I think it's the only actually study of its kind. And as such, it may help us to begin understanding how racial experiences impact the role that religious beliefs play in informing environmental policy attitudes. That is all I have for you today, and let's open it up for questions.
Can I comment, Walter? Can I just make a quick comment? Is that possible?
Go ahead.
Okay. In the beginning of the talk, Khari talked about the fact that his racial identity and growing up in Bethel influenced his policy, his research, and I'm responsible for that. I'm responsible partially for that, so I'm glad he made that point. I think also that African American researchers have to struggle with two questions. One question is a scientific question. I mean, there's a question about science. And the other question is the one that Khari raised about the well-being of communities, particularly marginalized communities. And so I think for social scientists, behavioralists who engage in models like we're doing, it's a struggle between the science part in terms of asking the right questions, having the right measurements, making sure your sample size is correct, and also the implications. And so I think is important in terms of the kind of research that we're conducting. We're struggling with both of these issues simultaneously. The next point I want to make is that Khari didn't mention this, but we are thinking about the fact that these surveys aren't asking the kind of questions you would ask respondents in a place like Detroit. And so these are kind of national broad questions. So have we asked questions about locally, where you live, sewage, backups, that might have, we may have found probably similar differences between Latinos, Blacks, and whites. And so these national questions may be hiding what's going on at a local level.
Good. Good. Any other questions for Khari? Just raise your hand so he might be able to see you.
I can't see him. He's yelled out.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yes, I was looking at your tables and specifically the survey. I was wondering what were the actions that the government were proposed to do in response to climate change? Like what did the surveyors tell the people, like, hey, the government's going to do this and this and this? Or was the question just, should the government do something?
Very good. That's a great question. It's the latter. And the question is, do you think the government should do something about climate change? And they left it at that. It's a very broad question. So the surveyors are allowing the respondents to define climate change as they see fit, define government take action as they see fit, and they don't probe any further.
Okay.
So I think that goes to my dad, Ronald Brown, was talking about a little bit earlier. It's very possible that people have different ideas about what government action means, or even what climate change actually means, depending upon where you live.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're thinking about, I have some of the people would ask, well, this slide right here, for example. I'll go right here. I'll go with this slide right here, for example. This is a slide of a meeting at Mount Hermon Missionary Baptist Church in Southwest Detroit, and they're meeting about what can be done about the Marathon oil refinery. Now, if you're at that meeting, the question about what do you think the government should do something about climate change, you may think that, oh, yes, they need to get rid of the oil refinery or force them to pollute less. But if you don't live in Southwest Detroit, or you don't identify with people that live in Southwest Detroit, then climate change may be some tactic that will have some effect 100 years from now or something. You may think that it has something to do with the polar ice caps or Renewable energy research, for example, that may come into your mind, and not something like, get this, force the owner of the refinery to pollute less, or to use more green technology. So this is an issue for survey researchers because in many cases, in most cases, the questions are broad. It's up to the individual to define it. Now, depending upon where you are, you will define this question differently. And so I'm long-winded, but that is why researchers need to think about asking more refined questions. So maybe follow up a question with, what about this? What about refineries? What about waste? What about renewable energy research? So good question. Good question. Good question. Yeah, someone in the chat said something. Oh, go ahead, Dave. Sorry. Go ahead. Yes.
Yes.
Great job. My question is, I think I missed something. Was everybody in the sample religiously affiliated?
No.
No.
So this is just a random sample, and they ask people, what's your religious affiliation? So I think maybe 15% said none, no religious affiliation, and maybe 20% that say Protestant, and 50%, or actually it's more than that, well, 60% that say Protestant, 15% say Catholic. So the sample is open to everyone, and we account for religious affiliation. And
yeah. I guess.
Go ahead.
Just do you think there's do people know, generally speaking, this phrase of humans are God's stewards? Do you think people generally interpret that in the same way that you're sort of interpreting it with the stewardship versus dominion distinction? Or is it possible that some of those interactions is due to a difference in the racial groups and how they're interpreting what, sort of that question means?
I agree with you. I think people may have different interpretation of what that means. Now, the question is, do you think that humans are God's stewards and that humans should take care of the earth? So that's the
okay.
That's
that
the
was
actual,
part of it. Yeah.
Sorry, that's the actual question. But again, taking care of the earth, they may have different definitions based upon who's answering the question. But that's the question that everybody asked. So they did define stewardship by saying that humans are tasked with taking care of the earth. That's part of the question that people
Okay,
heard.
so that was part of it. It was sort of defined for them.
Yes. I think Jeff, would you like to be introduced? Would you like to be introduced to a long time? Yes, I would, Jeff. Oh, sorry, that was a private question. Yes, Jeff. Other questions? Well, you know what? We have time. Go ahead, Claudio. Yes.
Hi, Khari. Following on a similar idea than David just asked, based on the data that you have, white religious liberals would be more likely to support environmental efforts. And the question is, what about non-religious and agnostic people that, the big question is, if I'm not sure if God exists, I can't think whether God is, whether we are stewards or not. And I wonder, when you base that question in ethics rather than in religion, how the distribution looks like.
Right. It's a good question. What you see in the data actually is if you separate the data as you just mentioned, so you separate individuals that say they're agnostic or atheists, or groups of people that say they have no religious affiliation whatsoever. Those individuals, their views on environmental conservation, as well as a host of other policy issues, look fairly similar to religious liberals, actually. The difference that you observe when you separate it out that way is among religious conservatives, among whites, only among whites, and religious liberals, and people that don't have a religious affiliation or identify as atheists or agnostic. Their policy views look fairly similar. And so in this data, what happened though, what we did is we looked at everybody and we accounted for their religious affiliation. So assuming that everyone is of the same religious faith or non-faith, how do people that view the idea that God wants people to take care of the earth, how are their views different from people that don't accept this premise to, answer the environmental conservation question. But maybe it does make more sense to just take out the people that don't have religious affiliation, at all, and look at them separately as a separate group and compare them to liberals and conservatives. Generally, what you see is that those individuals look fairly similar to religious liberals in their views on the environmental question and a bunch of other questions.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes, Daffy, I see your hand up.
Hi, Khari. So
Oh.
it's interesting, coming at this from the deductive standpoint, when I work in the neighborhoods, there's the environmental injustices all around, right? You could see them. And I wonder what your next steps might be, because I'd love to take you with me and just talk to people, about, why do you care about the environment? If not, why not? What are the priorities here for you? Because I think it tells a beautifully rich story if you do the inductive and deductive, but maybe that's the plan in future research too, right?
Well, it can be. It can be.
It doesn't have to be. I just am always curious. Are you going to continue with your large data sets, and look at the question? I mean, I'm going to send you a separate email about all the stuff about environment anyhow, because I'm going to want to connect you. But just, do you prefer that kind of approach where you're looking at the data sets, taking out the variables, seeing what comes of it? And then people like me that are down, like I would ask this question for you, when I'm out there, do you care about this stuff? Like that's, you look at the smokestack, that's right there. I'm curious now. I didn't ask that question before. I'm more like, do you care that you don't have a refrigerator?
Right.
So, this is incredible work, and I'm glad that I was able to attend today. But what's the future plan for you? I'm curious.
I'm a survey researcher, so that's what I've done all my career. But I'm open. I'm open to other approaches. I mean, in the work that we do, we often cite qualitative research. We definitely cite a ton of historical research in our work. And hold on. Yeah, I'm in a meeting. Sorry. Okay. I'm at home, people. I'm at home, people. I just walked into the meeting. Yeah, so I mean, we've done entire career. I've been survey research, but I'm open to it. I definitely value qualitative work, and that's the point I was making a little bit earlier in the talk. That I'm making an assumption that racial group positioning has an impact on the relationships that we observe. I'm making an assumption that the reason why we don't observe a relationship between environmental religious beliefs and policy attitudes is that for African Americans, if you live next to a smokestack, that's a practical question. That's not a theological, philosophical question of what needs to be done. What needs to be done is that they need to stop polluting. That's what needs to be done. Now, if you don't live next to a smokestack, then it becomes a philosophical question. Should we get rid of the smokestack, given that some people are being harmed, even though I'm fine? Even though my quality of life may be even a little bit better if we have the smokestack than it would be if we got rid of this. That's a theological question that for individuals that are not living in these communities can ask and deal with. It's a luxury, actually. If you live next to the smokestack, that's not a question that you can even have the luxury of asking. Should we do this? Yes. There are elevated rates of asthma and cancer and other cardiovascular diseases. Yes, now something needs to be done now. I'm making that assumption. Mm-hmm. But we could go back and forth with this, and we could see if some of this actually is the case. Because the survey research will not allow us to do it. The way that we currently ask questions is it's
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, and also I'm always happy to do that. If somebody has a question, just take them out when I'm out in the neighborhoods and just ask, and just happy to do that because it opens my eyes. But I just wanted to say too, offline, I love seeing your entire family sort of participating in the presentation from all angles.
Yeah, the sun coming in the room, right? Exactly. Dave, you have a question?
Yes, I was going to say, Khari, we've been in communication also with clergy in terms of that some of the clergy that we interviewed in our book, what they've done largely is to say they want copies of the book we're writing. So a follow-up we could do is to talk to clergy in terms of having our data talk with clergy, and let's find out the kind of sermons they're preaching that may actually activate individuals in their community. So we can take our survey research and continue what we're doing, which is to be in communication with clerical groups. The other issue I think what is interesting is the fact that the target audience among those of us who are scientists are not the people who are impacted by these phenomena. I think that the research we're doing, we're hoping the scholars at Wayne State, Eastern, Michigan, that they will actually go in neighborhoods and engage in politics. So our writings have real serious implications because who's going to read this work? Other PhDs, other people at the EPA. So I think that's so that we know that maybe for African Americans who are poor, or for Latinos or Latinas that are poor, or poor whites, that it's going to be hard to get them actively engaged in politics. But if we do this, we can use our data, hoping that the target audience will read it and they'll engage in actions that will improve the well-being of people that live in these terrible, terrible places.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, Khari, I just wondered more generally if you knew of any research that kind of like when thinking about individual environmental attitudes and like whether or not, or how people think about them, if they've ever explored sort of this difference between individualizing it versus thinking of it more structurally, right? Like we know that the big polluters have always like funded programs like Keep America Beautiful that try to make this like the environmental problem is because you're littering or you're not using all natural dish soap, which is ridiculous, right? It's like the Marathon plant, that's polluting.
Right.
So I just didn't know if there was any research that you knew of that sort of looked at differences and whether or not there were people who sort of say, well, I want to recycle and use all natural products, but I don't think the government should affect these industries, you know, or maybe the other way around.
Right. That's a great question. I mean, what you typically see is that, and generally these findings are specific to whites, but you do see ideological differences, obviously, on this question, partisanship, part difference in this question. And I haven't come across any research yet in terms of it looks at, how people view environmental questions, environmental problems as individual problems or structural problems. But I would assume that individuals that see these issues as linked to, I don't say malfeasance, but the way corporations, fossil fuels do business, that those individuals will probably have a much higher level, higher likelihood to say the government needs to step in. So if you think that these large institutions that are paying large sums of money to political action committees to ensure that regulations are not too high, you think they're responsible, I would assume that you would say that the government needs to step in because it's not fair. And if you think that, well, the problem is that people throw trash out of their car when they're driving, then probably not, But that's a good question, though. And that's also a good question to further drill down on.
Just to be clear, I do think people throwing trash out of their cars is a problem, but just a different one.
No, I agree. No, I know you're talking about, right.
There's a question in the chat.
Sure.
I think it's from Jeff. It says, were you able to explore regional differences?
Right, yeah, right.
And there's a comment also, there's a lot of work in attitudinal differences,
Right.
and gave you a reference to Andrew Jurgensen and Tom Dietz and Jennifer Givens.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks, Jeff. In our talk, in the paper that we've written on the connection between religion and environmentalism, we have not looked at regional differences. We generally control for region. So we just take region into account. So we just assume that if everyone is basically living in the same region, what's the connection between religion and environmental attitudes? So we have not specifically looked at region, but I think it is worth pursuing to see maybe there are, the connection between religion and environment is different based upon where you are. So maybe if you're if you're in California, which is a much liberal state in terms of they're having a Democratic governor and they tend to vote Democratic national elections, maybe the connection between religion and environmental attitudes and activism is different there than perhaps in a red state like Alabama or Mississippi that typically goes Republican. That's worth pursuing as well. Thank you. Yeah. Great questions.
Just suggested also that there might be urban-rural differences.
Oh, yeah, true. Yeah, I agree. True. True. That can be the next paper. Yeah, that can be the next paper. Yeah.
And Steffi tells us that we've got to love sociology. Any other questions? Let me see, there's another question.
I have,
Go ahead.
Patricia, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
first I wanted to say great talk, just echoing what Jeff and other people said. And I have a quick comment and then a question. My first comment just builds off of Jeff's comment about regional differences. My father goes to church every single day and travels a lot, and he has noted, I know that this is anecdotal, but he's noted to like visits me, he goes to church in Detroit and he notices that the sermons are much more liberal. And then he also told me, you know, when he's going to church in these like smaller towns that are more conservative, the sermons are much more conservative. And so it's the same religion. But he has noticed from like traveling around the country that the sermons definitely vary. And the second thing that I wanted to ask, and this kind of builds off of Claudio and Dave's questions earlier, is about religious affiliation. And if you noticed any patterns, particularly for the white respondents, because I just think like historically, white evangelicals have tended to be much more conservative. And then I was reading an article this year about how possibly white Catholics might be replacing white evangelicals in terms of holding these conservative beliefs. And so I understand it's probably beyond the scope of the paper and you don't do three-way interactions, but I was just wondering if you saw any noteworthy patterns with religious affiliation.
Great question. And yes, you do. So among whites, what you find is that individuals that affiliate with what we would call conservative Protestant denominations, those individuals tend to hold more conservative environmental policy positions. And it's not just on the environment, it's on mostly all positions. And among mainline Protestants and Catholics tend to be a little bit more progressive on the environment and other policy positions than are white evangelicals. And also what you find is that, you know, mainline Protestants, the liberal Protestants, the United Methodists and the United Methodist Church, not the Methodist Church, the individuals that affiliate with these churches also tend to adopt more religious liberal ideas. They
Can anyone else hear him?
I can hear you, but I can't hear him.
Yeah, I can't hear him either.
I think
His connection is lost.
Okay.
I think it might have just froze.
Yes.
Having all those kids in the house, they wipe out your internet.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
He's back.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'm almost done. Basically, yes, there are religious differences. I'm sorry, my internet cut out. It is 1:30. It was a good answer.
One tiny last question.
Go for it.
Because I'm going to reference this when speaking to other people.
Yeah.
In your words, since it's the last thing that possibly is going to be said, what is the 15 to 30 second version of what I really should be able to tell someone else from your research?
I would say that the 15-second version is that religious environmental beliefs are more strongly associated with white environmental policy attitudes than it does for African Americans and Hispanics. And that may have something to do with racial group positioning.
Wonderful, wonderful. To be able to summarize your research in such a way means that you know it, and that your performance in front of your dad and your mom and your kids was fantastic. I mean, you're going to get good Christmas presents. And so I want to thank you all for coming to this very important and very helpful talk as we consider all these religious ideas. Kennedy has a little wrap-up before you go?
Yes, Professor Brown, thank you as always for coming and doing our Brown Bag Talk. Today was a really good talk and facilitated some really meaningful discussion. As a small token of our gratitude, we do have a couple gifts for you. We have a mask and a journal with the Humanity Center logo on it. We would love to give this to you in person, but we'll be connecting with you via email towards the end of the semester to safely get these gifts to you. But again, thank you so much, and thank our audience, very well attended talk, for coming. And we do this every Tuesday and Wednesday, same Zoom link. Thank you again, and everyone be safe and happy holidays. All
Thank
right.
you.
Happy
everybody.
holidays, everybody.
Great talk.
Thanks, Kennedy. Good job.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
Have a good one.